Thank you very much, Frank, and to the speakers. I have to say, I support your degrowth philosophy when it comes to neoliberal economics because our climate is threatened very much by the frameworks of privatization that steals the very commonwealths of a nation, natural resources, public works that are natural monopolies. But I have to say I take exception also with the aversion to growth because I am involved in a growth economy with regard to rebuilding the earth. And to share my experience, I have used coconut technologies in the Philippines to reverse the adverse effects of harmful corporate mining practices in the Philippines that has destroyed soil with heavy metals. But with the proper technologies, you can reverse it and make them productive again. And so my question really is, maybe it's not so much that we should be afraid of growth. What we should do is oppose the kind of neoliberal economic growth pressed by neo-imperialism, by the Washington Consensus, but promote a growth in economies that rebuilds the earth, that restores the commons, and recovers the commonwealth that was stolen from us by neoliberal economic policies, such as privatization.
Yeah, thanks. Of course, within a steady state economy, you of course have things that are growing while other things are decreasing. So, I mean, I spent my 7 years in CSIRO working on heavy metal pollution, so I thoroughly agree with you that that's an important thing that we need to grow, the same as renewable energy is something we need to go in, other appropriate technologies. What we're talking about in environmental science, though, is the total physical growth that we're impacting on the planet cannot keep growing. So if we are going to be reducing coal mining and other sorts of mining, in fact, I have a friend who, University of Leeds, who's talking about peak mining is just around the corner where mining is actually using more and more energy for less and less returns. So it's actually running up against peak limits also. So yeah, there will be things within the steady state economy that are going to be growing and possibly growing quite substantially when they're in regard to healing the planet.
But that's what I mean by we have to support policies and oppose the policies because Australia is very strong on mining in the third world, especially in the Philippines, that destroys the environment. Yes. Australian aid, Australian investments, DFAT, should instead promote technologies and investments that restore and rebuild the damage that has been done. And that's my pitch for a growth economy.
And many environment groups have been arguing that for quite some time. In fact, a friend of mine, John Seed from the Rainforest Information Centre, unfortunately, in Ecuador, you have the bizarre situation. Ecuador has the rights of nature enshrined in its constitution, but has just allowed 1.6 million hectares of rainforest to be opened up for mining because of the corruption of the vice presidents who are going to turn around. But I mean, I'm saying we need growth in appropriate technologies, but within the understanding that we're not going to keep physically growing forever on a finite planet, because that's not going to work. Yeah.
Do you agree with Naomi Klein's view that the catastrophe of climate change will be the driver for a transition from a capitalist system which is predicated on endless growth and can't survive without growth, and some sort of post-capitalist future, and that climate change will be the driving force that will motivate people to effect that change? And is the banning of advertising a necessary prerequisite for combating the pernicious ideology of consumerism, which is an intrinsic part of this capitalist model of creating artificial false demands? And how will the provision of a universal basic income help to achieve a zero growth economy, given that many economists and politicians especially argue that economic growth is necessary for job creation, growing the pie rather than redistributing it. So,
I disagree strongly that climate change is going to be what will make the difference. I think you see around you now a manifestation of our biggest fault and problem, and that is capacity to deny and delude ourselves. With something like half Australians, I think, don't think there's a climate problem. It's probably worse in America. Don't think that emissions cause it. What we're up against is a powerful capacity of the human mind, warped by decades of postmodern trivialisation, celebrity, sport and so on, a capacity to simply ignore and deny problems which don't impact directly and heavily, and climate won't. It'll impact slowly in most cases and on other people first. So my argument a little while ago was that what'll hit you first is to do with oil and energy. It's only one of the questions on it.
You might want to comment on the advertising issue.
Oh, well, there's advertising, but also I'm glad you raised the jobs and growth, because there is a chapter in that in there. And as Peter Victor points out in his book, Managing Without Growth, the idea that you've got to have growth for jobs actually only came into economics at about 1950 as something. Before that, it was not seen as a given truth at all. And of course, it hasn't worked out, as he points out, that over about 20 years in Canada, which is where he's from, the GDP doubled, the number of people above the low income cut-off, as they call it, the poor, increased over that time. So, as I think we probably all know, trickle down hasn't trickled down at all. So the idea that we have to grow for jobs is it's a usual thing as soon as one talks about the steady state economy or any degrowth or anything that gets trotted out. But of course, okay, closer. In regard to the advertising, yeah, well, I think it's interesting. Many of the other ecological economics models don't actually mention consumerism advertising at all, which, as I say, Herman Daly argues for an advertising tax. I think it's great. In Sao Paulo, they managed to, if you're talking about change within, at that level, ban outdoor advertising in one of the largest cities in the world in Sao Paulo. So yes, the trouble, we seem to have this culture where everyone sits around watching Gruen on TV with ABC going, oh, how clever are these ads, rather than actually seeing it as a major problem we've got to come to grips with.
The steady state economy cannot, as far as I'm concerned, be decided upon without socialism, where socialism means socially owned resources, etc., and decisions made by people who are not just concerned with profit maximisation. I don't think it matters much whether it's top down or bottom up. But it's something within the nature of socialism itself, and capitalism's nature is profit maximisation, and that means growth. The socialist economy could decide whether or not to be a static, but isn't that the issue?
Well, I mean, look, I agree that there is a whole lot of positive change in terms of cooperatives that's happening, not for profits, such as Mondragon in Spain, which has a maximum income difference between everyone. 84,000 people in the organisation. There's only a maximum of a 9-fold increase in salary over the whole structure. And the Commons was mentioned, and I agree with Ted that change is almost certainly going to have to come from the grassroots basis. And I think the positive aspect is that there is now evidence that there are a lot more people getting together to create. For instance, there is the New Economy Network being created at the moment, and it's trying to bring all the disparate people, groups together to actually talk about the new economy we want to create. So I might see if pass it on to.
If we, by some miracle, had a socialist government installed tomorrow, what would its priorities be? It would be things like redistributing so that the workers can go to supermarkets and fill their trays better. In other words, the goals would be, as they've been in all of the revolutions in the last couple of 100 years, I guess, 100 years or so, and that is to run the same industrial system but distribute the benefits more equitably. Now, this revolution is totally unlike any before. In the past, the revolution was about getting control off the ruling class and running things in a fairer way, but running the same things, running the same industrial system, and indeed taking the fetters off and increasing production, which is gummed up by the contradictions of capitalism. If what I said in the first 10 minutes or so is correct, this revolution has to be about scrapping that whole system and worldview. It has to be about moving to a system that's about living simply in institutions and that will enable that. And none of that is remotely possible unless there's an astronomical change in ideas and values. So there's no point, there's no value in trying to get a socialist control of the state, in my view, unless you first have, in the minds of most people, the sort of values that I've gone on about. Because the socialist control, which in some sense there must be in the long run, of course, if it is simply implemented in order to meet the demands of people who still pursue, who value wealth, growth, competition, individualism, then you're wasting your time. There's no point in that. And so I go back to Kropotkin and Tolstoy and some of the other anarchists who realise that the task is to change the worldview, to change the values and the ideas so that people are not about competition and getting rich. And that, I suggest, points to the sort of work that you and I have to do. We have to work very hard for a long time, and maybe hopelessly, maybe we can't do it, but the task has to be to change that mentality. If we don't do that, then there's no point in getting state power if the state's just going to pursue and facilitate the achievement of goals that are still about industrialisation, affluence and growth.
Hi, my question is regarding the 4 elephants, and I am suggesting a 5th elephant. I'm humbly suggesting a 5th elephant for your consideration. The 4 ones you had were climate change, population growth, endless population growth, endless consumption, and the last one was limitless growth. Now, what I am suggesting as the 5th one is the flawed democracy that we are in now, where Western interest, the interest of major corporation, they dictate the government to do what they want. And we can see from the Adani, where the government wants to float a loan of over $1 billion. And we have seen in climate change, the government doesn't want to have what the climate, the scientists recommended. And they even bring a lump of coal into the parliament. So I'm suggesting you could include that as a 5th elephant, or you can call it a 5th mammoth, if you like. Thank you.
Yeah, look, I agree. I said there's at least 4 elephants, and I agree. We do actually have a couple of one chapter on democracy, and one was also another one that's also relevant in terms of dealing with the hegemony that we're faced with. So, I mean, I think there is some interesting stuff happening with participatory democracy, deliberative democracy around the world. There's also a chapter on the Green Prince project that the Australian Earth Law Alliance is trying to get going, particularly they're based in Queensland. So they're keen on bioregionalism as a basis.
And it is right across the developed nation, not just Australia. Same in US, same in UK, etc. So.
And of course, you shouldn't be able to give donations to political parties, which George Monbiot pointed out several years back at the Climate Change Action Conference here in Sydney, that, let's not forget we're stuck with this political system where people are allowed to make major donations to political parties, and we're all pretending that it has no influence. Well, of course, we know it does.
Yeah, thanks so much for the speakers. I mean, this topic tonight is probably the topic of the future of the human race and the planet. My point is actually following on from Bruce's. I am a strong advocate of eco-socialism because I think the real issue that we face is not various theories of what we can do or what we should do in terms of saving the economy, but the question of political power. The problem we face at the moment is that multinational corporations control the world. They do not allow us to implement these policies. They do not allow us to implement ecological policies. And I think, yes, it is a true point that has been made, that traditional socialism has, to some extent, underplayed, or a large extent, underplayed the ecological question. But I think that we've got to unite the two. I don't see it a contradiction. We have got to unite the ecological future with a socialist viewpoint, because unless we take power out of the hands of the capitalist class, we will not achieve anything. I just want to give a plug for, happens to be my article in this week's Green Left Weekly, but Glencore has been named in the Paradise Papers. These gigantic mining corporations are ripping us off blind, paying no tax, exploiting their workers. They've launched a huge attack on the CFMEU, and I'll finish with 2 points. One, I think that one of the most important books, which relates actually in the end to the ecological salvation, is Thomas Piketty's book, because unless we overcome the fact that the top 500 billionaires in the world own more wealth than the rest of the planet put together, we must tackle that question if we're going to tackle the environment question. And secondly, today we had a fantastic rally in Sydney of 15,000 workers for union rights. If these things are integrated, if we do not solve the political problem and the social problem, we will not solve the environment problem, because we cannot. It's not a question of top-down or bottom-up, it's both. We must take power out of the hands of the international capitalist class, or the planet is fried. That's my final point.
Frank, could I ask my question? It's directly related.
Yeah, okay, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, well, I'll ask my question because it follows straight on from the last one. I got a free copy of Green Left Weekly off the ground at the trade union rally today. But there's my bus protest, public transport as opposed to cars and expressways. I hope the camera gets it up close. The bottom line is I need volunteers from all you people Monday, December 4th, 11th and 18th outside Waverley, Randwick, Kingsgrove, Leichhardt, Mona Vale depots to hold up a sign saying, don't sell this to Adani's partner, a downer, EDI, with a French multinational. If we don't show support for the bus drivers, they're going to lose, because the union has already hamstrung them with 6 months of court injunctions. So they individually charged with contempt of court, $5,000 fine a day if they take any action themselves. That's why the travelling public and the commuters have to support them. Now, that was the short-term solution. My long-term solution, and I hope the camera can pick it up, is the poster, the wall thing behind you. Anti-conscription, vote no Australia plebiscite, the first and second plebiscites 100 years ago, and we're celebrating it. No war in Syria and the rest of the world, 2017. The war economy, have either of the speakers addressed that in their limits to growth, given the fact that 2/3 of the scientists in America work for the Defence Department and 15 states in America are totally dependent on arms production, and Australia's manufacturing and tertiary sector is increasingly being pushed in that direction. And I'll finish on this point. What's the difference between Elizabeth Clare Prophet and her survival camp arming themselves to the teeth in tin foods for the nuclear fallout, and Ted Trainer digging a few tomatoes somewhere up on the Central Coast? You both are going to be hit by the same nuclear bloody warfare. Ted, you're doing the right thing as an individual, but as the last speaker said, if we can't change everything at once, a few greenies in the bush are not going to save us from total destruction. Thank you. They're my questions. The war economy and the immediate bus thing. See me after if you can volunteer to man the barricades and stop the buses.
I'm not exactly asking a question, although I want to pick up one of your points, which is how do we get from here to there? One of the things that seems to have been neglected in this yes vote is that a remarkable number of Australians voted when they were not expected to, and they came up with a remarkably sensible conclusion. And Ted Mack says, you know, that the public are much smarter and much more far-sighted than the politicians, who are basically bought. So if we say that, well, look, hang on, this plebiscite worked very well. How about we have a few more plebiscites? And how about we go to the Swiss direct democracy system, where in fact all the significant votes are decided by the people and the government and public service merely implement them. So one of the things we need to take, I mean, it's always got to grasp a moment, and at the moment, everybody's talking about this vote that we've just had. What it proves is that we don't really need parliaments. We could actually make direct democracy and then tell the parliaments what to do, because they've been bought. It's only a binary system, and both sides are bought. So since we don't want them to be bought, we should say, look, we don't really need you guys, basically. We now have the technology to run direct democracy, and we think that the Constitution needs change. Everybody knows that. God knows my father was born in North Korea, for God's sake. I'm ahead of everybody in the stakes here. And you're a Democrat. And a Democrat, yes, but I have checked it out, and in fact, North Korea doesn't recognise dual citizenship, so there. But in order to get from there to here, we need to if we said to politicians, look, your whole parliament isn't needed, and we want a constitutional change that downgrades your importance in a mega style towards direct democracy in Switzerland. When they say that's anarchy, we say, well, hang on, it works in Switzerland. We should actually challenge their right to exist. Once you set that running, I take Ted's point that when you're near the tipping point, and we're near the tipping point, everyone's jack of our politicians, the whole bloody lot. Nobody wants any of them, really. We've got to get to that tipping point and say, look, that's where we want to go. Now, justify your existence or piss off. And that's I think we need a real voice to say that. Maybe then, in the transition process or in their response to an existential threat, they might lift their game. What do you reckon?
Wow, these are some very interesting contributions. Shut up, Jefferson. Shut up, for Christ's sake. Give us a break. Yeah, give us a break. Let's take this a bit systematically. We're conspicuously...
All right, I'll be the token female. I want to endorse what Jim said and what Ted said. We've got to work from both directions. Absolutely, at the same time. Also, this is the most inspiring comment I have heard for so long, and what an opportune moment when all these skittles are falling in federal parliament, one after another, because of citizenship issue. We could put forward this thing that we want to restructure our constitution like the Swiss model. I love it. And it works both ways. And finally, working from bottom up, like Ted, and top down, like Jim and the other eco-socialists, let's also work laterally. Let's remember that over 50% of the population are women who are actually socialised and acculturated with different values and different skills, and that many of them are environmental activists and been working away at these things for decades. And then we have there another model that we can look at in terms of making the kinds of transformations that we need. Thanks.
I might say, for those of you who don't know Ariel, it's Ariel Soleil, who's an author, an activist, and academic, developing ideas about ecofeminism. An excellent book on ecofeminism, which I think would be nice to have you at Politics in the Pub talking about on a future occasion. But tonight we're going to have to move towards a conclusion. The speakers have raised some really key issues: the power of multinational capital, the war economy, the failure of the state, and the need for an alternative such as direct democracy. These are very fundamental questions if we're talking about the nature of the problem and how we get from here to a more sustainable and decent future. So I'd like to invite both of the speakers to give some concluding comments on whatever aspects of that clutch of or cluster of issues that they feel they'd like to comment on. Ted, you look deep in thought, and for good reason.
I really don't have very much to add, apart from saying it's quite inspiring to see all. As I said, I oscillate between despair and hope, and one of the things that cheers me up is the fact that you're there, you exist. There are people like us who are concerned and critical. I guess I get a bit despairing about the extent of acceptance and the lack of radically critical thought, but I'm saying I guess there's nearly, if not all of you are in the radically critical category, and I think that's most encouraging. I guess I go back to my grassroots sort of theme. I think the most important thing any of us can do is nag, is raise these issues in all the contexts we make, and try and get others to, think critically about the system, and especially the whole affluence syndrome. The problem in this society, I think, is indifference. Most people are besotted with the electronic stuff and sport and so on. And if we can just get more concerned with, where we're going, and a cheery thing on that, I think, is the fact that things are deteriorating, because that'll prod more people to realise they've just got to take these things seriously. So that's a wordy way of saying good on you all.
I'd love the Swiss system, although I do remember reading that there were some really good proposals put up to the Swiss system, of course, that didn't get up, which would, still, I think being willing to push for a change in how we do democracy in Australia, I think, is something that it's definitely one of the chapters that we talk about there, but it's something that needs to be worked on. In front of the war economy, sure, Lester Brown in his book World on the Edge a few years ago actually looked at what it would cost to solve most of the major environmental problems in the world, and worked out we could probably fund those solutions with about 20% of what we spend on the military worldwide, which is, how we get that change. That we're building, however many it is, Collins-class submarines, or new submarines to replace the Collins-class submarines that we've never actually used, when we can't actually spend money on actual transition process. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, agree entirely. And as I say, I personally, as an environmental scientist, most of us have to deal with depression about what's happening in the world fairly regularly. But I also see, having been an activist for 40 years, I see a positive change, that there is dialogue happening for what were once taboo topics, And I see that's a really positive thing because we have in the past talked about, you know, I remember being at a dinner somewhere and someone raised I raised climate change science, and the head of the house sort of said, oh, that's a contradiction in terms. And all his family said, no, we're not talking about that issue. But of course, we do have to talk about those issues. We have to have dialogue. So groups like this that is having that dialogue and going out in society and raising those issues makes the elephants in the room shrink and actually breaks down that denial. And I still argue that if we actually do break down the denial dam, we can still turn things around, even though for 30 years we have basically done very little. But that's the key thing. Can we get past denial and actually accept our problems and use our intelligence to solve them? We're only going to do that if we can get that dialogue and break the denial. So you're part of all that process. Thank you.
I think we've had a marvellous session tonight. I believe it's the last session for the year, isn't it? So I don't know if we should drink the pub dry, but
I think the first one next year is the 5th of February.
5th of February, yeah.
1st of February.
Yeah, so it's the first Thursday in February, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, well, look, I want to wish you all a good summer until Politics in the Pub resumes, but more immediately tonight to thank our two marvellous speakers, Hadyn Washington and Ted Trainer. Thank you very much.